Thank you. Oh, this is amplifying too. I have a loud voice, so hopefully it's not going to be too loud. Appreciate the opportunity. It's really fantastic to be in an environment. Boy, it's been almost 20 years. When I lived in Michigan, I was adjunct faculty in the environmental engineering program at Michigan State, and it's always fantastic to get into the open thinking environment where all kinds of ideas appear to be more possible than they are outside the university walls. But what I want to do today, and the subtitle I put there, I said a sustainable growth perspective. One is I want to say water stewardship. Part of what's happening in the private sector space is the most for-profit companies are recognizing that water is such a critical component to their growth that they have to think beyond just the traditional return on investment and efficiency within their own operations and actually engage with other stakeholders that we share the resources with. So the only thing, it's outside the comfort space everywhere. If you look at sustainability and corporate social responsibility, we're typically engaged with our customers, with our suppliers, or our customer's customer. But here we're getting into the only thing that we might have in common when we get into the stewardship level engagement is that the other party might have as much of a vested interest, if not more, in the same resource, but nothing else in common with us from a business perspective. So it's a very interesting area that private sector is moving into. And the perspective I'm going to share with you is a combination, as a disclaimer, right? It's not the Ecolab perspective per se. It's clearly heavily influenced by the Ecolab perspective, which is my day-to-day job, but also a perspective that a lot of personal thinking that's gone into some of these areas, even outside of our Ecolab core operations. So what is Ecolab, right? As a company, I will tell you a little bit about what we do, why water is important to us, and then get into areas outside of water specific to Ecolab's business and our customers' business, but overall to the entire private sector. And the one area which probably a lot of you, if you're involved with water, are grappling with, there's a lot of buzzwords around the Nexus, water as a common thread between energy and food, agriculture, and also public health. And the relevance of the entire value chain, all the way from the source materials, all the way to the mining and the energy production, all the way down to the end use and disposal, and considering where the hotspots are, where we need to focus, and where do we go from here. And again, I'll take the liberty of posing probably more questions than talking about answers, because the private sector doesn't have most of the answers, and we're always looking for, and there's no place better to pose questions than in an environment where people think well outside the box. So I will probably end up with more questions in this presentation than answers. But Ecolab itself, right, just a quick context here. We as a company, we actually went through a dramatic change over the last 2 years, where for the first time in our life, we're 91 years old. We're founded in 1923 here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And as a carpet cleaning company, basically used to be that in hotels, if they had to change carpets, they had to take the room off service and essentially pull it out and clean it. And we came up with an in-situ carpet cleaner, and that's really where Ecolab started. But where we are today, 2 years ago, we went through rather significant mergers, acquisitions of a company called Nalco, based out of Naperville, which is into heavy industry of water cycle management. And last year, we acquired another company called Champion Technologies, which is focused on resource efficiency in the traditional energy production sector. So as a company, we have redefined what we are and what we mean to the customer people we serve. And really, there are 4 brand pillars. It's clean water, safe food, abundant energy, and healthy environments. And we deliver all of these by tackling different aspects of both the supply side and the demand side of these. So if you look at energy, it's about being able to produce energy more efficiently without all the resource bottlenecks, and also about saving energy on the use side so that we get more mileage out of energy. And same thing with water, is a lot of focus on the demand side of water and really putting water to work, which is a huge piece of the private sector. So we have the luxury of actually working in an area that all has to do with quality of life. So we can really focus on how we do it, as opposed to playing difference on what we do. And that has given, we have a core sustainability team that is focused really on delivering sustainable outcomes. And if you look at our business chart, a pie chart, if you go to our annual report, you'll see about, it will say about 20%, 25% of our business is related to water. So, but we, as a corporate sustainability initiative, are focused totally on water. Why? Because cleaning and sanitation cannot be achieved without water. Most public health issues are related to the quality of water. Almost all the water use, whether it is for paper making or whether it is for mining or whether it is for heavy industrial use, steel making, any kind of metals refining, you're heating or cooling. In food and beverage production, you're cooling, and in heavy industrial, most of the time, chemical and petrochemicals, you're heating. And the medium through which you're heating or cooling anything is water. So pretty much water happens to be the common thread, and we recognize that if our customers don't grow, we don't grow, and our customers cannot grow without efficient use of water, particularly in most of the geographies where they are going to grow significantly, are heavily water impacted in terms of water stress, which is primarily the emerging market. So we quickly beamed them, and if you look at it, and I wanted to throw this bubble chart out, I might refer to this later. What this shows here is water in the context of a total, not the altruistic social responsibility or anything. Private sector companies are in business to bring returns for their investors. So looking at it in terms of revenue and operating income, so the water withdrawal by different sectors, and the color of the bubbles represents the different private sectors here, per unit revenue on the x-axis and per unit operating income on the y-axis. What jumps out at you, and the size of the bubble is the overall aggregate volume of water that company used. So here are examples, right? If you look at it, that's a paper company. These are big chemical companies. I didn't put the names up here, but these are publicly disclosed information. You can go to the annual report and get the revenue and operating income. You can go to CDP Water, which is where I got all the water information from. These are aggregate numbers, right? What jumps out at you is that there are certain sectors that, relative to their income or their revenue, use a lot of water, withdraw a lot of water. Now, clearly, not all the water is consumptive use, right? You look at this yellow here, the thermoelectric power sector, they withdraw a lot of water, but the consumption piece of it is small. They heat it and they put it back into the same watershed. What really jumps out, you look at the lodging sector, which is hotels. They have small bubbles. They're not big water users, but relative to their operating income, I mean, typical a hotel chain, major multinational hotel chains, they're working between 10 and 15% operating income. They're not making the 50% or 30% operating income that the pharmaceutical companies and the oil and gas companies make. So if you normalize it to the money that they make for their investors, they are very much exposed. And unlike these mining, iron and steel, and chemical companies and paper companies, they don't self-source their water. Hotels and food and beverage companies, more often than not, rely on public water supply that the residential user relies on. So there is an aspect there on what water you're competing for, and also the cost. If you look at it, one question I've been asked when I put this chart up is, million cubic meters per $1 million, what kind of units is that? You know? So you could take that, right, and I can rationalize it. Globally, a cubic meter of municipal water, delivered potable water, costs about $1, $1. So you could pretty much look at this number and say, okay, let me put dollars instead. What if? So there's the what if question, right? Reality is these big chemical companies and paper mills and steel mills are not spending $1 per cubic meter on water. They're self-sourcing all day. All they see in the bill is the electricity that it takes to pump the water out. So if you monetize it in that context, you will realize very quickly that the water will completely wipe out operating income if everybody in the world paid the same for this clean water. Clearly, the quality of water needed is different, so the costs are different. But that is what we are talking about here. Some sectors are very vulnerable, and we'll talk about some of those vulnerabilities. So we as Ecolab, when one of the first things we did was, we said, oh, let's look at the cumulative impact we are having through our products and services. We took our top 5 water efficient platforms, which is a laundry system, a ware washing system in a restaurant environment, chemical mixing technology that we developed for the pulp and paper industry, conveyor lubrication without using water that we developed for the food and beverage industry, and a rather significant feedback system that we developed for the cooling tower for the industrial cooling industry, that is all added up, and pretty much just in 1 year we figured out that we saved 21 water equivalent to water used by 21 million people. Now we can say aha and we can sit on the laurels, but the reality is that number, does it really mean anything? If we saved all that water on from the Mississippi and the Missouri or the Great Lakes, we're really not having the impact. That same 21 million people, if there are 21 million people in Mumbai, India or Shanghai, China, now the impact is humongous. So there is really, in all this aggregation of numbers, we are really looking at inventory and not impact. So we know that there are challenges. It's all about the quality of the water. We are too focused on the quantity. So here's a question for you, right? I have 3 questions, but they're dispersed through this. What, in your opinion, is the fraction of water on Earth that is actually available for sustainable human use, reasonably replenished in a short cycle, right? Is it 2.5%? Is it 1 in 10,000? Or is it 2 in a million? Just think about it for a minute, right? It's pretty interesting because we've seen all these numbers being thrown out. But the key there is, what do we think is sustainable use and extraction as opposed to just water that's fresh water? So how many of you think it's number 1? Just a show of hands. Number 2. Number 3. So actually, here's the thing, right? It looks like majority of the people here said number 2. 2.5% happens to be the fraction of water on Earth that's fresh water. Reality is, most of that fresh water is locked up in glaciers. A lot of it is in groundwater. Some would argue that that water, yes, it gets replenished. It's reasonable, but some would argue that it's not a reasonable replenishment cycle to mine groundwater. We should really rely on surface water. But then you look at the surface water, right? There's only a small fraction of that surface water that's, again, readily available. There's a lot of fresh water that's surface water, but it's nothing but a projection of groundwater tables where there's land depression. Not every fresh water is like the Great Lake system, which is a white spot in flowing water, right? So if you really look at it, you're talking about less than 2 gallons out of every 1,000,000 gallons of water on Earth is really fresh water that is readily replenished, which is the water that flows in our rivers. And that is the water that pretty much all industrial and commercial operations and pretty much most ancient civilizations that grew up in riverbanks. Not everybody went to Southern California and set up shop in a desert, right? We've done that now, but reality is that's what we've relied on. And that stress is starting to show quite dramatically because we've focused on the quantity and not on the quality. So it almost feels like this whole, the rhyme of the ancient mariner, right? Water, water everywhere, and all the boat that shrink, called water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. And that has become reality almost everywhere. I was born in India. The wettest place on Earth, Guinness Book of World Records, is in northeastern India, a place called Tiruppunji. They get more than 400 inches of rain a year. The last year, on World Water Day, I participated in an industry event in Singapore. When I boarded the plane here in Minneapolis, the New York Times had an article, this article, that talked about Tiruppunji, where women have to travel a mile round trip 5 times a day to get the bare minimum water that's needed for their household for 3 months in a year. So the wettest place on Earth, 3 months in a year, because the infrastructure doesn't exist to store water at the right quality that people need, basic human survival, people have to travel 5 miles a day. And it's mostly women. I mean, I think we would have solved the world's water problems if men had to go fetch water, but that's a whole different subject matter we can talk about, right? So there's the seasonality of stresses. This is a water footprint network map that shows how many months in a year does the demand outstrip the supply. So if you look at the map of the US and just look at annualized demand and annualized supply, we're a blue country. We have a lot more water available than our demand is. But you look at the seasonality and you see all the red spots even in North America, right? But then you look at places like in northern China and pretty much all of India, and there you see 9 to 12 months where the demand outstrips the supply. So this is a very critical piece, right? Again, this is a piece that most of us, the NGOs, most private sector, a lot of academics are focused on. It's easy to measure, its volume, its mass. We're comfortable with kilograms and cubic meters. However, there are a whole bunch of other things that come in. Now, besides this quantity stuff, there is the quality issue. More often than not, more and more of these watersheds, even water where the quantity is abundant, the quality doesn't match the need. And then there are issues of annual variability that are superimposed. So seasonal variability, yes, it shows up as floods and drought, right? But then you deal with annual variability that's so significant. And we have done maps, looked at maps like this. The World Resource Institute actually has an online tool called Aqueduct that allows you to go zoom in on any watershed and look at this data. And annual variability is very critical because businesses, they don't want to plan on up cycles and down cycles all the time. We want to keep growing and growing and growing all the time, right? And typically, we want to grow faster than the GDP. Ecolab, for the last 10 years, we have typically grown at 3 times the GDP in almost any geography you look at. So how do we do that if there is all this annual variability? And overlaying on top of that, all the unknowns related to new regulations around water that are going to be implemented or new reputational risks that are going to come up just because of what kind of business you're in. So we started looking at some publicly available data because it's very difficult to go and set up all this mega data to collect it yourself. So one of the things is Global Water Intelligence publishes about 500 municipalities around the world how much the cost of water is for the water user versus what it costs for them to actually extract and treat the water. This is all municipal water, right? And the numbers are quite striking. In North America, pretty much it's US and Canada municipalities. These are 500 plus municipalities worldwide. US and Canada, we are 100%. We are recovering the cost. There's no headroom for capital improvements or maintenance. Europe, Western Europe, they are ahead. They're charging about 30% more than what it costs today. So they're actually putting money in the bank for doing capital improvements and everything. That's a big issue we have with all infrastructure in North America, right? But then you look at the rest of the world and the story pretty much falls apart very quickly. You look at the extreme, a place like South Asia, the 6 countries in South Asia, only 2% of the cost to extract and provide treated water is paid for by the by the user. 98%. Now this is a double-edged sword, right? The UN Global Compact recognized that water is a basic human right. So there is this compelling political pressure to provide water and not charge for it because it's a human right. But what happens is, and we'll talk about it, the private sector and commercial enterprises get to piggyback on that. And that really distorts the situation because there's all this water that's being used for really commercial activity as opposed to basic human needs. And the numbers are quite staggering. And it's not even Central Europe and the Caucasus, it's the same deal. In the areas of the world that are most water stressed, recovering the least amount of the water through the water user, cost of providing water. It changes in other places. Australia and New Zealand actually have been over 100%. But look at Australia. These are the 5 big cities in Australia. The rate changes for a cubic meter of water. I told you the world average is around $1.15, right? They have almost quadrupled their rates of water because of the drought they've had over the last 8 years. So if you put on your free market mindset, this is the canary in the coal mine, right? This could happen everywhere else if the true cost of water is being recovered, even if they were at market prices and they were recovering. When drought kicks in and all the climate change impacts kick in certain geographies, you could see quadrupling or tenfold increases in water prices. And that is very critical. And then there's the question of, are we cleaning up the water that we are taking back to the levels that someone else can use? Or is it out of sight, out of mind? So how much are countries, municipalities, this is not industrial wastewater, this is municipal water, treating the sewage, how much are they spending on wastewater compared to what they're spending on water? And this, we are looking at it as an indicator of potential future regulatory risk, because what will happen is the ambient water quality will get so bad that regulations have to kick in to basically internalize these externalities. And there again, you look at it, North America, US and Canada, very good. We are actually spending more on treating a cubic meter of wastewater than a cubic meter of water, which makes sense. It should cost more. Whereas rest of the world, even Europe, is not at 100%, you would think. And again, same thing here. There's hardly any wastewater treatment expenditures incurred in South Asia, so you know what is happening to the ambient water quality. So this is a looming risk that is just, it could happen any time. And I mentioned the whole piece about the public water supply being relied on by the private sector, right? I did this mapping for the hotel industry in Asia Pacific to compare their reputational risk. They're relying on municipal water. What this chart is, the y-axis is the ratio of water use per guest night in a hotel, comparing it to the water use per person per day in the local community. So this is, talk about sticking out like a sore thumb. You look at all these Asian countries that are in orange here, the water use in a hotel, multiples. It is water features, it's swimming pools, it's fountains, it's all these luxuries that people want when they're spending the money to stay in a hotel. Or it is a transport of Western tourists traveling to Asia and basically providing them an environment that they can be comfortable with, even though the surrounding community doesn't have that. So you look at this map, right? Europe, Singapore, New Zealand, and Australia, Western Europe, and Japan are pretty much one-to-one. The water use in a hotel by a hotel guest doesn't exceed that of the local community. But everywhere else, it's a huge reputational risk. So it's not, we have customers in the heavy industry. We have electric power plants, paper mills, steel mills in India and in China that have been approved on the drawing board, huge investments, capital secured, but they cannot pull the trigger and build these plants because the local community will not let them get the water. So there you're talking on the heavy side, right? It's surely going to happen even on the light, what I call the warm and fuzzy commercial sector, which is hotels and restaurants and everything else, because we are competing for water that is very scarce. And then you hear the thing about the Nexus, right? So we'll shift gears and not talk just about water, but water in relation to all these other quality of life issues. The UN says by 2030 we'll need 50% more food, 40% more energy, and 30% more water. The problem is it takes both water and energy to grow the food. It takes energy to produce drinkable, usable water, and it takes water to produce electricity and a lot of energy, more and more, even oil and gas, because the gushers are gone and we are now pushing oil and gas out with water. So overall, there's all the interconnection, right? On top of that, most sources of energy we're using have these huge human health implications. So let's peel the onion, layers of this onion, right? We talked about water that goes into making energy, but here's all the energy that goes into making water, right? About 50% of the energy consumption in the US is related to some kind of a water-related service, whether it is to move the water, to treat the water, to heat the water, to cool the water, whatever. So there is significant amount of energy. So from an industrial, commercial perspective, it's very critical because the dollar value of the energy when you repurpose the water within the fences is a lot more than the today's dollar value of the water. So we repeatedly make the compelling case that if you reuse the water within your own facilities, you don't have to reheat it or recool it. And you don't have to get the municipality to pump it to you, which is a big distribution cost. Couple of dramatic examples of the Nexus. India, July 2012. I don't know if you know this. In India, agriculture, irrigation water, pretty much the electricity, the farmers don't pay the bill. They had a very bad summer. Farmers cranked up all the irrigation pumps. Huge increase in rural demand on electricity. India had done the right thing in that they invested a lot in low carbon electricity, which is basically hydroelectric. But the monsoons failed. So not only are the farmers pumping a lot more water, using more electricity, the hydroelectric output dropped dramatically because there wasn't enough water behind the dam. Another thing India did, again, a checkbox, good thing, electrification of the railroads. Over 25,000, close to 30,000 kilometers. We have less than 5,000 kilometers electrified in the US. 35,000 kilometers of railroads electrified. That's how most people move. And India moves more people in a day than I think we move in a year in Western Europe and US combined. So the grid failed because of this dramatic imbalance between supply and demand. But all the things they did were actually right. They provided water for agriculture, which made India self-sufficient in food. They produced green electricity, and they electrified their transportation, which are all good things. Basically, 670 million people, 10% of humanity, lost power for 2 days. The biggest blackout ever in the history of the world. So what do? This is because of not thinking systemic. All the individual silos, if you look at it, all the right things were done, but there isn't the systemic approach to looking at how these things are interconnected. Here's another example, right? I don't know if you folks saw this. It was in the news last week. It's actually a repeat of, it's called Hogwash 2 because it happened a year ago in China. River is flowing through Shanghai. Last year they picked 16,000 dead pigs. This year the count has already gone up to 3,000. The story is out. What happened is these are pigs that were infected with the swine flu, and the infrastructure doesn't exist for these farmers. In the US, if this happens, you go to a veterinarian, they put these pigs down, and they incinerate it. You basically have a mechanism to get rid of it. In China, they didn't have it. So when they had this vast outbreak, the farmers just dumped the pigs in the, what do we use? Like we have throughout humanity, we've used rivers, so they dumped the pigs in the rivers. It happened a year ago, right? And they put a stop to it. The backroom story is that the new provincial governor was a huge fan of sausage, and sausage was the outlet for these quote-unquote compromised pigs in the past. And when he became the provincial governor, he put a stop to that practice, and that is what led to this glut of all these infected pigs that they couldn't do anything with, which is why the farmers dumped them. But that is a reality of health. It's a vicious cycle of water affecting health and health affecting water. The other less dramatic story we don't talk about in the Nexus context, we always talk about quantity, water embedded in energy, energy embedded in water and food and everything else. We don't talk about the quality piece. As an environmental engineer, I know that what I did was accelerated biomimicry, whether it's a carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, nitrification, denitrification, BOD removal, anything. All of those basically delivered through the mechanism of water, right? And this is actually becoming more and more prominent, not just algal blooms in inland waters, but entire sections of the Gulf of Mexico and areas outside Australia and New Zealand, the ocean basically having no life at all because of agricultural runoff, which is a huge issue. One thing that has also happened while this agriculture and the domestic water trends have gone sort of in the, it's a mixed bag. So you look at agriculture, right? And I was just talking to John Foley about it, about a metric. We don't have a common, and at this institute, you are developing the metrics on what is the water use per calorie produced, because that's really the true output, right? But typically, you go to USDA reports, USGS reports, it's all about acre feet of irrigation. And you look at it, acre feet of irrigation went up. The only reason it's going down is because a lot of the agriculture in North America is shifting from the arid west to the east. That's the only reason it's going down. And a lot of the improvements that happened in the 60s and 70s had to do with irrigation. But you look at domestic water use, we have actually gone up 40% from about 90 gallons a day to 120 gallons a day in the US per person per day. So it's a very, very significant increase, and most of it non-essential use from anyone else's perspective except those of us who are used to it, right? So you look at the global agriculture use, you look at the countries that are going to be feeding the world, including North America. You look at South America, you look at Africa, agricultural water use is very low, but that's not going to remain low for very long. I mean, Latin America is a very big part of our supply chain in terms of food supply. So that's going to change, right? The red line is the average, but you can see that the pressures are going to go up. And this is the water footprint network actually looking at the flow of virtual water through agricultural products into the Netherlands. They're based in Amsterdam. And you look at it, and what jumps out at you again, the most water-stressed region in the Americas, Mexico, the most water-stressed region in the world, India, and all the water-stressed areas elsewhere in the world are actually shipping a lot of virtual water into water-abundant Western Europe and water-abundant North America, and that is the reality. So while we're doing all this, right, you would think we are water-abundant in North America. So here's a question for you, right? What percentage of groundwater withdrawal in the US is used for irrigation? Now, we're not talking about surface water or rainwater, groundwater, right? Is it less than 20%, 60 to 70%, or greater than 80%, right? How many of you think it's less than 20%? 60 to 70%? Greater than 80%? Okay, I think most of you are thinking it's greater than 80%. It's actually, it's been growing, so it will be close to 80% very soon. We are close to 70% now, and you look at irrigation, it's it keeps going up in terms of how much of the groundwater. And so that's really, if you look at it from a certain perspective, it's not just that Texas and Florida and California, which immediately comes to mind because they are water stressed, but even in the upper plain states, water tables are dropping. Actually, NASA had a map that they posted in terms of water table drops, and it's quite surprising to see the dramatic drop in water tables in the upper plain states and how much groundwater that Nebraska and Kansas rely on. And then I want to shift focus from the food nexus to the health nexus, right? And this is an example. We've done maps like this for the rest of the world, every region of the world, to basically talk to our hotel customers. This is endemic waterborne and foodborne and pest-borne illnesses. Hepatitis, typhoid, malaria, and cholera, and you can see that Asia-Pacific region is all red for everything, right? And travel plays a big role. You look at that transmission of cholera and you look at the spread. It was basically in Southeast Asia, China, and India, and it's now all over the world. And what makes it happen is travel and tourism. And our customers, a very significant portion, almost 20% of Ecolab's business, is to prevent this, provide clean, healthy environments, and hotels, and that, by the way, is a computer model of the influenza virus, which is quite dramatic. But hotels are at the nexus of travelers and local populations. So they basically are the place where disease either gets transmitted or gets nixed. And our role, our value proposition to the customers in this sector is to make sure it gets nixed so that that map can, and that is a sustainability value that our customers see. The travel and tourism sector, if they think that they can change the color of this map for Asia Pacific or Latin America from reds to green, that is a value that they bring to the local communities that's going to enhance their business. And they see that. So it brings a whole different perspective to what we thought of as just a performance outcome, as a sustainability outcome. All these different offerings we have to intercept infection transmission, disease transmission in all these vectors within a hotel. Now the customer is looking at it from a social value perspective as opposed to purely operational business. Again, transitioning from efficiency to stewardship. And that is really something that is happening. Unfortunately, you look at the water component of this, and I gave you a couple of examples. Where is the business case? You look at on-premise laundry, 8% of the cost of doing laundry in a hotel is associated with water. You look at dishwashing in a restaurant or a hotel or a full-service hotel, water is less than 2%, 1.2% of the total cost. Most of the cost is in labor, you can see both in warewashing and laundry. And you look at something like housekeeping, right? The single biggest water user in a hotel is the guest room, but none of it is housekeeping. It's all used by the guest. So it's a water used in the shower. If a hotel is in the warm climate, then cooling towers are the next biggest user of water. So the issue becomes, how do you make the business case? We have products that will cut out 50% of water use in a warewashing platform or 40% of water use in a laundry. How can you make the business case? One, the customer is using municipal water that is heavily subsidized. And two, water is a very small component of the total cost because of that. How do you make the business case? There are some areas where you can really make the business case. Thermoelectric power generation is a classic example. Next to agriculture, biggest user of water, right? Whether it is nuclear power plants or coal-fired power plants. 60% reduction per unit of electricity output in the US, if you look at the last 50 years. Actually, it was a 35-year period. Dramatic. Here's the downside. That is per unit kilowatt hours. Electricity production in the US in the same period went up by a factor of 4. So we reduced the intensity by 60%, dramatic, but the output actually went up by a factor of 4. So the absolute water use has gone up very significantly. And then you look at industrial and commercial use, right? Again, I'm using this unit of income. So you look at $1,000 income, annual income, and then look at the water use per day. The point I'm trying to get across here is heavy, not just heavy industries, all industry and commercial use, private sector. You remember the chart on agriculture, remember the chart on domestic use, headed in the other direction. There's been a lot done. All the low-hanging fruit has been taken. We've achieved dramatic improvements in efficiency in water use because we could make the business case in these places, because it was low-hanging fruit. But now we are past that. Now we have to squeeze more water out. And why do we have to squeeze more water out? Here is the water use intensity on liters per, again, normalized to population. You look at Asia, look at Africa, look at South America. Industrial commercial water use is minuscule. But that's where all our production has gone, right? This is a fascinating chart here, which shocks you when you look at the bottom line. The largest exporter of embedded water, now this is virtual water that went into products that a country exports, is the one country in the world that has physical quantity stress, quality stress, reputational risk, financial risk, name it and they have it related to water. And that happens to be the country that's exporting the most virtual water in the world, and that's India. So the reality is most of the industrial growth is going to happen in India and China, and these countries are already exporting a lot of their water and they have a lot of stress. So we have to go beyond the low-hanging fruit and we have to tackle. And what is also happening is if what's happening in the West continues to happen in the emerging markets, we have another problem in terms of how much of the water used by industry and commerce is self-sourced. That is, they don't rely on public water supply. What is it, less than 20%? Is it almost 50%? Or is it greater than 80%? How much are they competing for this public water? Anybody think it's less than 20%? 40 to 60%? Greater than 80%? So here it is, right? It's actually around 50%, and it's been growing. It used to be 20%, and the Livermore Lab that looks at water use maps it all out in terms of whether it's coming from public supply or self-source, what are the sources, what are the uses, and where are the sinks. And what is dramatic here is even in the US, we have gone from industries and commercial enterprises self-sourcing their water to actually relying on public water. And the economies of scale have really driven that. So again, think about the implications, right? Now you're competing for more visible water because you're competing for water that the local community is going to use, as opposed to you're quietly flipping the switch and pumping the water out of wells that you own the water rights to, which is a different story. And that is what is going to make a lot of these issues a lot more in your face for our private sector customers. And the fact that the water is not just in your own operations. This is an example of automobile manufacture. You look at, we do a lot of work with Ford and all the big three, all the Detroit manufacturers in reducing the water use within their manufacturing facility. 5% of the water life cycle of water associated with an automobile is in the manufacturing facility. Most of it is buried in the iron and steel and the paint and the polymers and everything that goes into the supply chain. And of course, if you live in Minnesota and the road gets salted, you spend a lot of water washing your car. So it's in the use phase and in the supply, not in the operational phase, where we tend to focus on a lot. We think of industry as being the place where you can deliver these efficiencies. And as a company now, we realized we serve customers with water efficiency offerings in mining, in steel, in energy production, in power production, paints, plastics, polymers, everything. So we actually have a bigger opportunity to have impact on these further up in the supply chain. Remember that bubble chart I threw up right in the beginning? The biggest bubbles are the ones that are a lot farther up in the supply chain. We recognize that many of them will have issues with sourcing their own water. And even if they do, for example, we did a big project with Dow in Freeport where they were sourcing their own water, but we still implemented a huge cooling tower project and reduced so much water use that the community of Freeport, Texas, in West Texas, was able to dramatically attract all kinds of new businesses and new residents to come there, which they couldn't have done if the water efficiency wasn't realized. So that transition, further up in the supply chain you go to, it's happening. So is water the new oil? Well, as a person who has worked with water all his life, I would say jump up and down if it was, right? Reality is it's not. It doesn't have a market price. Water, oil, yes, it is subsidized in some markets, but in general, there is some semblance of a market price. As you saw, it has a lot more local issues, a lot more temporal and spatial issues associated with it. And it also happens to be a lot more essential for human survival than energy is, which is really the next step. So it's really not the new oil, it's a lot worse. So then you say, oh my goodness, is it the new carbon? Unfortunately, a lot of people in the environmental and sustainability space have been thinking about water like it's carbon, trying to come up with this aggregate metric. Look at quantity. A metric ton of CO2 equivalence is the same. It doesn't know any boundaries, nothing. Water, it's all about the context, and the context keeps changing over time. Context changes depending on what kind of industry you are. Context changes depending on what quality of water you need for your operations and what quality of water comes out of your operations. So it is so specific and so complicated. Unfortunately, it's not the new carbon. It's a lot worse, and it's a lot more immediate. So that's a lot of questions, right? So where do we go from here? Reality is Rome ran out of water. When Rome ran out of water, the Roman Empire went out and built aqueducts and brought water in. Those days are over. I don't know if you saw it. A month ago, it's in California, the state legislature refused to allow water from the Sacramento River Basin to protect fish, to refuse to allow water to go to Southern California to protect agriculture. So that is the reality we're dealing with. Thank goodness for Canada, the Great Lakes water is protected. It didn't go to the southwest. But in reality now, we can move water from one part of a state to another. People will fight it. And that is the reality that's all over the world. And there are huge issues surrounding water. You look at the Mekong Delta, a lot of Southeast Asia depends on water that actually can be controlled by China. Bangladesh can either have drought or drown in floods depending on what India does on the water in the Ganges River. So these are all issues, trans-border issues that many countries have, that a lot of the conferences I go to, I'm on panels with Department of Defense experts talking about the security issues around water. It is a new, they keep saying the next war is going to be fought over water, which is quite interesting, right? And we cannot deliver those 10%, 20% efficiencies we've delivered so far. That's gone. That's not good enough. It's not going to move the needle. We have to deliver dramatic efficiencies, and I heard John talk about this in terms of planetary levels. We have to focus on where we can get most bang for the buck, because time is running out. And really, we have to focus on the supply chain and see where the need is most critical and where we can actually achieve. And we cannot do this with the current pricing structure in the free market. Forget it. Our CEO, Doug Baker, said something that really hit me hard. He said, once you put a dollar sign in front of a number, businesses already know what to do with it. We are so programmed, any major corporation is very well programmed to deal with numbers that have dollar signs in front of them. If they don't have dollar signs in front of them, it becomes very challenging. So one of the issues that we are focused on is working with sectors and customers, shadow pricing of water, essentially phantom pricing internally, where you're actually putting the value of water to your business as opposed to what you're paying for it today. What is it worth for your business growth now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, and putting that value at least in your decision-making structure, even if you don't show it in your balance sheet, so that you can drive long-term strategic decisions that are not held hostage to this artificial construct of water being heavily subsidized by governments because it's a basic human necessity. So that is really where our head's at, and open to, I think we have about 15 minutes here for some questions and some discussion, open to what you all have to think about the same subject.
Yeah, so raise your hands if you have any questions, and please wait for the microphone so the online audience can hear your voice.